widespread way and done particularly strictly. Secondly, too harmlessness, and then thirdly, weighing this off, and also just having a chat as to why the comparative of not using this principle so much is probably done with something that's well and reasonably. So I want to flag why this principle is so widespread and popular today. Several reasons for this. One, I want to note that it's particularly used in old crime novels, like for example Agatha Christie. If you use something in the third chapter, then it will oftentimes be implemented in the later chapters. What this means is it becomes particularly widespread. The reason for this is because people tend to use templates and base their things on things that other people have done before. They like to seek inspiration from other authors because they know what works. They often make allusions to other authors in their works. Therefore, this is something that's gained popularity. Secondly, the rise of film industry has also meant that when we tell stories, we also imply this a little bit more. The reason for this is because you need to have quite a simplistic view of things in a film, i.e. so that people can watch it when they're not really paying enough attention, like for example, scrolling TikTok, etc. Therefore, you can't have too many details in a film. The imagery needs to be quite in your face, so you're only really having that as necessary. At the point where film rises, this is what people expect from a story in general, so therefore they expect this from literature as well. Thirdly, I just think you're taught this in school, right, by your teachers. They're saying, take note of this is going to be used later, etc. So when the next generation of authors rises up, they have an expectation that this is what's supposed to occur in work, therefore that this is something they do. So I think that this was particularly widespread, so I think it's very hard for you as an author to opt out, because this is just the expectation that the principle ought to be applied. Why then is it applied particularly strictly? I want to note that it said, you're only supposed to use it if it's necessary. And I think quite a lot of things just don't fulfill that criteria. What I mean by this is a lot of imagery, a lot of connotations, a lot of other things that exist, and just would tell you more about the character, but isn't actually necessary to forwarding the narrative of the plot, therefore do not meet the criteria, and therefore often aren't used. Therefore it's kind of expectation that publishers will necessarily question why you've included this detail, etc. I think this is especially true for things like side characters. They'll be like, they're not particularly relevant in the first place, so why have you included the fact that this side character has a gun when they're going to fuck off and disappear? Go.
So, and you see this in like deep poetry and stuff like that as well. Clearly, Chekov's one doesn't apply to just the physical items, but to important themes, pieces of imagery, etc. that function in the text.
I think, but then also use less themes and less pieces of imagery. The reason for this is because it's only to an extent necessary. Some of this is obviously necessary, but at the point where you're expected to do only to the extent necessary, then you're constantly having to justify to your publishers why this particular detail was included. And they want as less details as possible because of the expectation. Therefore, there's a chance that some of your details, imagery, and connotations just isn't going to make the cut. Why then is this just necessarily bad? I think the first thing is that this tends to trend towards a lack of details. I think I've already proven this in the framing, but I'm going to explain what this looks like. I think, one, it means we have less knowledge on the character. The reason for this is because maybe the character isn't going to shoot the gun, so the gun gets cut, but I think the gun is still a useful tool because it demonstrates that maybe the character is particularly violent. It makes you feel a certain way, it makes you feel anxious, but the possibility that they could shoot the gun in the future, even if they don't, kind of keeps you on the edge. Secondly, oftentimes this looks like a lot of imagery, i.e. it's not necessary for the plot that we know a lot about the side character, what they're wearing, how they style their clothes, etc., what they're carrying in their pockets, but I think it's quite interesting because then it allows you to picture the scene a little bit more. The more details you have, the more you have. Thirdly, I just think the more details that there are in the book about things leads to the more connotations that you can infer. This means it's more realistic because you know and can imagine every single thing that is going on in this room, therefore you're immersing yourself into the story more. What are the implications of this? One, I think the story is just more realistic when you read it. This means you can immerse yourself into it more because more imagery is used, there are more objects, there are more like connotations, etc. I think this is just broadly good for literature. The reason for this is a lot of people read books because they want to have some form of escapism from what is going on in the world. At the point where they can more easily access this because the books that they read are more detailed, they're enabled to do this more. Thirdly, I think it just allows for more discussions, and this is crucial because this works even if you don't buy the framing, right? Note that at the point there are some details that appear not really necessary for the book, like, I'm really unclear as to why they described the fact that this gun was on the wall when it wasn't used. This means that it's more likely you have discussions with other fans about this. I want to note, the hardest part of reading a book is when you finish it, because you know that you can never read the book for the first time again, and that's really sad. To the point where there's so many details in the book that haven't been explored. This means that people create like fan fiction about the details. They describe the details. They come up with theories as to why this person had the gun in their room when it wasn't explored in the book. So then you can share and you can create community, and then you can like read the fan fiction that might be really good, and then you can just explore your favorite character more. I would love to be able to do that with some of my books. I think it's fun. The third thing is that people write more critics can write more on it. At the point where there's more details, at the point where they're not necessary, then people might, I don't know, like criticize why they did that. People might have a debate about why they chose to include it when it wasn't necessary. This just leads to I'm not gonna lie, like people like, why do you study English literature and this kind of thing? The point where there's more availability of critics, because there's more details in books, this enables you to do that more. Second thing, and this also applies if you don't buy the framing, is it's just so fucking predictable when you know that every single thing has a purpose within the book. What do I mean by this? It means at the point where you see the gun on the wall, you know that that gun is going to be shot in the future. Therefore, it is unlikely that this is going to be a surprise to you when this happens. You know that when you see someone mention a violent thing that happens in their past, you know that they're probably going to be violent in the future. Therefore, it's unsurprising when this happens in you. So you probably know too much. I think this is really bad in instances of things like murder mystery, because it loses the entire appeal, because they become more predictable. Secondly, I think what a really key part of reading a book is the fact that once you immerse yourself in it, when something surprising happens, it shocks you to your core. You feel it. Your heart starts to beat faster as you experience what this character is going through. But at the point where you predict that this is going to happen because you saw the gun on the wall, it hits you less emotionally because it's just predictable. Thirdly, I also just think it's fun to throw the people off, right? You leave some clues, like some of them will be relevant, like a gun on the wall might be shot, then something else like someone's knife in someone's kitchen might not be used. So then people might think that it's going to be used and then it doesn't actually, so then it keeps them reading because they're curious, because they don't know what is going to happen next. Why then is not applying this would likely be done well? One, I don't think it will be overused, right? I want to be very clear here that when authors write every single thing, every single word they choose to use, there is intention behind it. Therefore, the very fact that they've chosen not to apply this principle in certain instances is a decision that they've made really, really carefully, because it's just how authors make decisions. Therefore, people can also analyse why they've tried to not apply this principle in the particular circumstance. Secondly, I don't think fans will be frustrated with this. The reason for this is because they can make fun theories about the objects and the imagery that wasn't used later, and then they can do all the things that I've said and they engage with it even more. But I also think that there is a balance. Note that they'll still use other old literary traditional techniques and stuff in order to make their books appealing, etc. And also they would not do this in a silly way, because the few instances I can think of where this has been done, like Pretty Little Liars, love that show, but they did this a lot, people did kind of criticize it. So going into this, if you're not going to apply this principle, you probably take that on board, you do it in a not shit way. Nope. For fan theories, for fun, OG.
Off on a night, this is incredibly difficult. Tells you more about me than any detail that they get under their side of the house. The absence of action does not mean that that thing does not do anything. We still get the details under our side of the house. The absence of things is important. The gun that is not fired on the battlefield means that that person had a moment of humanity, means that they realised what they were doing. The absence of things does not mean that that thing is useless. So all their case on details is out of the debate, because just because something is not used does not mean it is not useful, and therefore still falls under our side of the house. The details that we talk about, the details that they include, are the ones that are irrelevant, are the things that you put at the beginning and then do not actually use ever again. And those are the ones that are useless. We get more literary analysis, we get more things that are actually meaningful. There are two cases from all today. First of all, on why the reader is more satisfied. Second of all, on why the process of writing is far greater. First of all, on why the reader is more satisfied. Because under their side of the house, you include things that are not used, like ever used, that are not important. Things that are never brought up again, things that the author didn't intend to ever be useful. When they're writing, an author includes many details and they put many things in the story. They're not necessarily going to be used, or maybe they thought they were going to be used, but they ended up not being used. Under our side of the house, the things that appear are eventually resolved. There is a reason why that thing was included, and you eventually understand that. Whether that is from an actual action that happens, or whether that's from an internal monologue of that character, or whether that is from the clear subtext that the writer creates, given these are good writers that happen. The comparative between the two sides is, there are details that are not useful to any large plot points under their side of the house, whereas the details are always going to be used for these. The tension that is released, the gun that is on the wall, is you're trying to understand what that means. Under their side of the house, you're left with questions. Why is the tension being released under our side of the house much, much more important? There are two reasons. I just think, one, as individuals, we are far more satisfied when our questions are answered. We invented God and we invented religion because we liked things being answered, because we were uncertain, no thank you, as to why thunder fell from the sky, as to why my mother was dying. I think humans have an innate need for things to be answered and questions not to be left. The problem is, under their side of the house, questions are left. You don't know why the gun was on the wall. You don't know why the person did this thing, why they didn't pick up the phone, why there was a thunderstorm that day. No, thank you. You think these things will have meaning because this person is a literary genius and you glorify them, but they ultimately do not. And they can try and say that, oh, but then you'll talk about them through fan fiction. Like, one, fan fiction is the same under either side of the house because fan fiction is about adding details that don't exist, but also community is quite irrelevant. The other thing is, we just want to test this premise. I don't understand why they don't explain why not knowing is actually beneficial. They say you talk about it, but talking you achieve through other means. I would argue and contest that not knowing is really damaging to that individual because we like satisfaction, we like knowing what's going on, we like conclusions. So the second thing is, there's now a new way to go back through the story. And I think Elliot is very, very correct. I like reading books that I've already read. I like going back through them. But the thing is, under their side of the house, you go back through them and you see the same details that you were left with questions with at the very first time you read it. But it doesn't change. You don't have a new understanding. You don't have anything else to add. Under our side, the detail, that painting on the wall over there, now makes sense because the author revealed what it was meant to be there for, what the context behind it, what its significance was. You have a new understanding of the book the second time you read it. Under their side, you just read it and you're still left with more questions. I think this, one, incentivizes people to read the book more and actually incentivizes people to have more discussions because they talk about the exciting things they discover. But second of all, I think it gives them a more satisfactory second read. OGs say, oh, it's very predictable because the details need to have answers, but just no. Like, these are literary geniuses that write really, really good books. Like, they don't need to have things that are predictable. The gun's on the wall. Maybe you know the gun's being used, but who is shooting the gun? Is the gun shooting someone else? Is the gun shooting the person who owns the gun? Are they committing suicide? What are they doing with the gun? Is the gun ever going to be used? Because maybe they pick it up and they're about to use it, but they eventually put it down because they have the moment of humanity. It's not predictable. That was lazy analysis, Ellie. Before I move on to the second claim on writing, I'll take a point from Seiji. OG?
Yeah, I just think this is silly. Listen to our framing on how unfortunately you don't get all this kind of stuff because of how this principle is applied.
The principle is applied, i.e., I'm going into that right now, so let's talk about that. How does the process of writing change? Let's just talk about what the process of writing looks like under either side of the house. The first time you're writing a book, you get caught in your own mind. You get caught in details, you get caught in world building. Because you're creating something. I think that's quite a special experience for many people. So they don't stop and look back at what they've written. They don't take a second to think about it. They just put the world they have in their head on paper. That happens under either side of the house. The difference then becomes, under our side of the house, you go back and you question the details that you have. You say, what does this do? Is this actually necessary? Why is it in it? Under their side of the house, you don't need to bother with that. Obviously, you still edit, but if a detail just does a little bit of world building but isn't absolutely necessary, you still leave it in under their side of the house. And this is important for two reasons. And also it's important because it just responds to what Ellie just said. But the other two reasons, substantive reasons, are, one, you actually consider more of the details that you're writing. You are more harsh with yourself because your publisher will ask you why this thing was in your book in the first place. Because as per your abiding by the literary principle, you need to do that. But the problem is, authors cannot do that naturally or by themselves without this principle. Because authors believe that every single word they write is often genius. They get caught up in their own heads because they've created this world and they feel this is very special. When you force them to remove things, you force them to pick the good metaphors and the good details and expand on them. Under their side of the house, you get a hodgepodge of things that's not actually useful. But the second thing is, I think this is incredibly important, things happen and change over the course of the story. I.e., you may not know as an author why you put something in the very first chapter, but once you finish the book and the book has changed the course of the plot and it's changed its direction, you eventually realise why you did that. Maybe you had an innate psychological understanding of the character you were writing. Maybe there was a subconscious part of you that was changing what happened. The thing happens under their side of the house. You don't have the thought process where you realise, oh, this is why this happened. You don't critically examine it. Under our side of the house, you do. So you force yourself to consider what actually happens, which means you bring out the natural details that happen. You bring out the genius that is innate in these writers, and you force them to consider why they're doing it. When you actually think through what you're doing, you ultimately come up with better things. Under their side of the house, you just write the details and do not consider them again. When you're not forced to cut, you don't have to be critical with yourself. And I just think of I don't know, this is really stupid analysis for what I thought was a really beautiful speech, but think about the publishers who have economic incentives. They don't want your books to be too long because that just costs a lot of money and paper and ink. What this means is they force you to cut things under our side of the house when you expand them a lot. Under their side of the house, when you're not forced to cut things, you just have a lot of surface level metaphors that don't actually mean anything. So proud of those.
We have in a toolbox of many different tools that authors can use. We just oppose this particular tool because there are probably other preferable tools that we could use. Also, secondly, this is a trope that's probably been overdone to some degree. There are some good works that have utilised this, but as Ellie points out, it's probably relatively lazy to rely on this and continue using this in a predictable manner that is relatively boring for readers. Cases where this doesn't apply. I'm not really sure on ArtBench in what genres this does apply, on what books, on what authors. I think it would probably be helpful for them to characterise when it's most useful and when it actually helps the readers actually engage with this. I think there are probably, unfortunately, quite a lot of genres that feel the need to have to be boxed into this sort of toolbox that isn't specifically useful. For example, fantasy genres probably feel the need to have to utilise this because this is what audiences are used to. I.e., as Ellie points out to you, this is used quite commonly in movies because audiences tend to not be able to focus, and we tend to follow patterns based on early crime books. But genres like fantasy don't necessarily fall into this because people engage with them for different reasons. For example, I don't tend to engage with Lord of the Rings and read those types of books specifically so I can follow a very predictable narrative pattern from the very start of the story. I tend to follow and read fantasy books so I can engage in the immersive world that it is because it's so entirely different to my very own reality that I live in the daily, right? Meaning that it makes no sense for this narrative to be a predominant one or one that ought to be revered and utilised in absolutism, because then it means that stories get boring and don't necessarily transcend genres. I think this then means that it just makes other genres more boring and more copy and paste across the board, which means it actually means that people just have less ability to actualise their preferences insofar as being able to access literature that actually meets the goals that they want. I.e., a lot of readers want an immersive world with a lot of different details that maybe won't be useful for the central narrative all the time, but it means that it gives you potentially background information about the room that you were in so that you can fully pretend that you can see, smell and hear everything that's going on in that room, so that you can picture what the characters are like, so that you can think about the side characters and maybe write about them later on, so that you have a bigger richness to your world. I think then, even if we have to bite the bullet that there are irrelevant details, I actually think this is fine because we have to think about what the purpose of literature is, right? Insofar as I think it's for audiences to enjoy, which we've already proven to you that you can gain an additional sense of enjoyment from being able to have more details within the book. But secondly then, I think it's hugely cathartic for the author to be able to actually write in the ways that they want to be able to write. I.e., if you want to include irrelevant details and go, oh, maybe it'll be nice for the audiences to experience some shock factor later on, I think it's probably a good thing that we allow them to do that. Further than to insulate this case, if you're going to oppose this sort of tool, then I think you probably rely on other different types of useful literary tools that still make the book relatively engaging and still good enough literature for the author, for the readers to follow, right? As in, you can have things like alliteration, you can have things like character tropes, you can have things that thematically still fit into maybe previous genres or still recall to you previous books, previous themes. For example, you can have vintage settings that still maybe kind of mirror some settings of Agatha Christie, but don't necessarily follow the same template. Because then you actually still get to make your own mark on the world as an author and get to be unique in who you are, rather than just creating another 50th Agatha Christie book, but within the modern era, right? Meaning that there are actually more modern books that are probably different and good, and this is probably useful for people. A couple more useful rebuttals. I think they say you probably just need to be relatively more harsh. I think they probably are already relatively harsh in the way that they write things, insofar as authors still probably have to keep to a limit, but then they probably just do more things like add details that they really enjoy adding in. Maybe they enjoy talking about the descriptions of trees, all those kinds of things, at which point they maybe remove certain other elements of the story. So I think it's probably unfair to say this. I think especially when artists are usually their own most harshful critics, right? Insofar as every artist looks at their painting and looks at their work and looks at their book with very, very harsh eyes because they wonder how people are going to perceive it. Is this the right colour choice? Is this character saying the right thing? Should I change this piece of dialogue? I think it's probably unfair to say that authors will get lazy and just include every single detail, when there are probably choices that they make because they enjoy them and because they want to make the world richer and because those details mean something to them, even if it doesn't point towards a central narrative. I think it's incredibly reductive to say that authors won't be harsh within their own work when they're already their greatest critics. I think this is something which is relatively useful. I think then they also point to the absence of this and say that it points to a moment of humanity, and this doesn't fall under our definition. I think it probably does, because it's not outright mentioned as an absence or as a very big choice later on, as in there's an intention to not use the gun, then it probably does fall on our side insofar as like it's just a mention, right? So I think this is probably unfair engagement. I'll take a few out for closing.
Yeah, so the reason why most fantasy readers prefer Lord of the Rings to the Silmarillion is that a lot of the world building in Lord of the Rings is functional to the plot, whereas a lot of the things in the Silmarillion are incidental to the plot. Chekov's gun means different things in different genres.
Sure, this might be true, but then that still means there are audiences for both types of books, right? And this ought to be something that we probably want to be able to encourage insofar as things have already been done, so then it is also fair to be able to include other types of books and other types of things into these types of genres. I'm also just unclear then why we're weighing this on scale, right? Because presumably literature is not just made to be consumed by the masses. Given that there are different audiences for different things, presumably then we weigh on things like richness of the story and like the experience of the readers, right? So I'm genuinely unclear why it needs to be the most palatable to the largest group of people, as insofar as like you probably are just able to self-select for the things that you enjoy the most. So I think it's reasonably fair for us to be able to like do this. Secondly then, on Ellie's perspective on fan theories and being able to write good fan fiction, I think this does make for better communities and better fan fiction, right? Insofar as like the more details that you have, the more things you have to engage in. I actually just think this is fair, because if there's one central narrative, you don't really get that many fan fictions of like traditional Agatha Christie stories, right? Insofar as there's like relatively little to be able to do and side quests apart from the main narrative. Whereas I think if there's okay, you're right, maybe you can, but like look up on AO3 or Wattpad how many there are, right? I don't think there's that many in comparison to other types of stories, right? I just think there's many more strings for you to be able to pick at. And the more strings there are, the more stories there are, and that means that there's actually just a larger and better community that's able to talk about these things. Lastly, on Ellie's talking about the feeling when you close a book. It is true, it's incredibly sad when you finish a book that you've really, really enjoyed, and there's just nothing left for you to really do with that feeling. And the more types of threads that you're able to pull quite early on, and you're able to discuss with other people and create alternative realities for the characters that you grew to love. And also, might I add, you probably grew to love them more because you discovered useless details about them. Like sometimes I wish I knew what my character's favourite cereal was. And sometimes when that detail's in a book and it's completely useless, I enjoy it all the more because it adds a richness to the story that has nothing to do with the central narrative. The Cheerios actually serve no purpose. Maybe that character's just violent and they own a gun, but I love knowing that detail, despite the fact that it serves nothing and that gun is never going to be shot. Maybe the cereal will never be thrown off the table. Legitimately, I'm all for useless tools as long as they're used in like conjunction with other things. I think we create good literature, that's it.
An application, then a question of like quality and innovation within the novel, and then secondly on reader satisfaction. OG says that like not all genres fall under this. My first question is, I don't think we have to defend the predominance and forcing of this. If you actually look at their mechanization, it is quite weak. Like they say films do it, so do they also do fantasy movies. Like the point from closing, I don't know the movies, but they were there, they were mentioned. The second thing is like school can teach any literary device. They themselves concede that other literary devices exist. So it's incredibly unclear to me as to why the predominance must be defended or is even manifested. But I think that secondarily, as is pointed out, this looks different in different genres. I do support fantasy, I do support crime, whatever it happens, but it must serve purpose. The things that are used must be revealed as something necessary. Cool. That out of the way, I want to talk about the question that is pushed on us about oversimplification and how this like makes this books basically a little bit boring. OG says that there's less themes and less imagery included. I want to say that this is necessarily contingent on these details being badly integrated, because I think that many details, and even a lot of those details and a lot of those themes, if they're greatly integrated, does not mean that we have to sacrifice them, right? There is no necessary limit to the amount of themes, but also OG does not explain the inherent value of it, like exploring 70 different themes, if we can think that like just 3 explored in depth and with a lot of purpose are good. So what is there at our side of the house? This is quite good. I think the first reason for that is because you enter a sort of pressure of nuance. Because look, we talk about significant details. Now the thing is, if a detail is like totally irrelevant and it's describing a grass or describing a leaf or whatever, it is probably not significant. It is probably serving absolutely nothing, which means that it's probably elementary world building, because I do have to paint a picture for the story to occur in at a very basic level. However, these like, what does the info slide say, like the important details or whatever, must be portrayed as important important, yet they must not be obvious. So you must strike a very nuanced middle ground. And if you as an author fail this, and you make something incredibly obvious, so you put 7 guns on the wall because the person will kill 7 people, that is obviously bad writing. But the reason why you care about this, and it's not funny, is because this means that people will not read them. They will not engage with such literature, which means that you filter out those bad authors, which means that there is necessarily a pressure created to push you to the highest of nuances and highest of standards of writing, because it's incredibly difficult to make an element important for the story, yet not revealed too soon. The second reason why this self-selection works is because I think you select imagery that necessarily adds value to the theme and adds value to the Cheerios, because now you will describe a cherry blossoming not because you believe it is aesthetic, not because it is pleasing imagery, but because necessarily, I don't know, it is important to Japanese culture, and now the arc is reflective to something that happened in a historical period, right? And I think this is very, very good, because you mean that you must select details that necessarily serve a purpose. This is good for, firstly, the reason that I think it creates, a feeling of a holistic story. That is to say, when you engage in something, it will all come together eventually. I think that there is just a pleasure in understanding a book when you close it as a more holistic thing, and that you're able to conclude everything as something necessary. Because if you are able to include details on their side of the house that do not lead to a conclusion, it means that at the end, you're more likely to be confused. I think that confusion at the end is only good and only necessary if you can revisit the book and find the purpose and the answer, not if it's a random Cheerio that nobody fucking gives a shit about, because that will not create satisfactory and useful reflection on the book. That will just create a question. I think that this is not satisfying at all. The second thing then that I want to talk about is a specific trade-off of why I think proliferation of details and themes is far worse. Actually explain why what isn't necessary purpose is inherently unnecessary. One, I think it is simply distracting. I think it is likely that you get stuck on those details. Now, sorry for the lack of better words, but when you're reading, this genuinely breaks your flow state. If you're able to, like, your mind, as you're processing something, go to 7 different details and think about the Cheerio and think about the other grass or whatever, this means that your mind gets preoccupied and it is distracted from the narrative of the story and from the purpose of the story. I think that this creates like an incredibly unsatisfactory experience while you're reading. But I think secondarily, I think that we don't do like as uncharitable analysis as OG tries to say. We don't think that authors are straight up lazy, but we think that once you start to create something and once you start to write something, right? If you do not have additional pressures, you can quite literally just be wordy and go on and on and on and on. I don't think that it is because you're lazy. I think that it's because it's the lack of restrictions that are put on these like absolute creative freedom that OG doesn't explain to me why I should value. But I think that secondarily, I think that because we don't care about absolute freedom of the author is because it can actually be filtered through useful themes, right? That is to say, I can have the absolute freedom to like go on and on about imagery insofar as it is useful to something, and I want to say that there is inherently no trade-off, because I as an author either way write about something that I care about. It might be my personal experience, it might be a political stance I care about, but it will be something that I care about necessarily, because if I don't care about it, I will not go on and write a book about it or write a poem about it. This means that when I filter my experiences through themes, they necessarily all serve the same purpose of me proving, or not proving, writing about something that I care about, which means that I don't think that there's actually any substance that's being lost whatsoever. Yes, Josh?
Is it not just incredibly formulaic to have to build a story around a gun, which means that writing is actually far harder to engage with on your side if you have to build a story around an object?
Okay, firstly, complete assumption for some reason that I must firstly be oriented around the detail and then write the story around it. I think you probably first have the narrative and then you think about what are interesting ways to do this. But I think secondarily, huge burden to describe why this is wrong. I can fucking pick a detail that I find incredibly deep and probably incredibly innovative, and then I pressure myself into new forms of writing that I would not experience on the other hand before. Lastly, on reader satisfaction, I think Callum already explains what we are more watchful, but I think that the two things that are important here. One, when tension is loaded because you put like a hint at the start of the book, when it realizes the subconscious imprint when I read the detail, and because the detail, as I already was explained due to the pressure of nuance, is going to be good, it means that I probably remembered or like somehow in subconsciousness imprinted this yellow salt that is incredibly important. This means that at the end of the book, the tension finally releases. It is so satisfying. But the last thing, OG says, you can never read a book again. This is true for them. This is not true for us. On our side of the house, you can infinitely go back. And I want to use the analogy of memory, right? When I revisit something from far back, I revisit it from new perspectives and with new knowledge, and I process the memory again. This happens in exactly the same way, because I'm able to go back to the details, see them in a new perspective, read the book better, write the book better. Oh well.
Goes as follows. Pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we sing straights, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. Why was that impactful? Why did it make you feel the way you did right now? It's because it has a weight to it. It's got a sparseness to it. It's got a criticality to it. The symbols, there's only 2 real visible symbols in that poem, take on fortitude in your mind when you listen to it. It stays with you. Government bench, live the uncritical life. 3 responses first. First, I think the Wikipedia style analysis of opening government I don't think works, right? The sort of like, we leave in Easter eggs, we put in a few red herrings here and there. That kind of thing is poisonous to the reader, the author, because the author gets addicted. They get hooked on the easy access to justification or legitimization, validation from their audience when they do these kinds of things. But second, it changes the relationship with the audience. The audience becomes less, Susan Sontag against interpretation, becomes far more looking for like Dark Souls or Elden Ring players, looking for lower details and that kind of thing, and not engaging, learning to engage with the thematic elements of the plot, not having rich experiences. Secondly, and you just get more pastiche. You have more like films being filmed in like that shitty A24 house style, because that's just what's popular at the moment. If you're not thinking critically about whether you need to have a long shot here, whether you want to have a split diopter shot in this scene, those kinds of things, you do much more often when you're not critically thinking about the reasons why you're doing those kinds of things. Thirdly, that's also true for stereotypes as well, because you can have on our side of the house, like, well, actually, there's no reason for the black character in this story to have grown up in poverty or to have grown up in Chicago. They can be from the same country as everyone else, same city as everyone else, same class as everyone else. It wasn't necessary for the plot. The gay character actually doesn't have to die at the end. Even though it was writing expressively earlier on in the text, I thought to myself, oh, that's how it felt right to me, it felt normal to me because of my stereotypes. But when I think about it now critically, actually there's no reason for them to die at the end. Or maybe there is, and it actually was important to the plot of the story. Those kind of things you defer to far more on their side of the house. 2 arguments for closing opposition. First, we get more rich, complex stories. Chekov's gun increases the interactivity of the text, right? So the characters and items, but we'll just stick up for the example of a gun right now. If you want to suggest the appeal of violence or danger in a sexual encounter between 2 characters, you use the gun that's already in the text rather than the knife or whip that only exists in that particular scene, right? Because you have a general ideology of sparse storytelling, but also that knife or whip doesn't have any purpose. It has a superfluous purpose. If you already have the gun there, it wasn't necessary to include. So that same gun, which was synecdoche for violence, right? It's also polished by the maid, or it's stared at and pondered by the prodigal son upon his return, or it's sold in times of poverty and bought in times of wealth. So it gets this sort of thematic weight in terms of interactivity with violence and love, wealth, power, patriarchy, family, all these things it gets interactions with through the way it's deployed in the text in that story. It creates therefore a complex rather than a simple symbol, but with an avenue of interpretation easily available to the audience through the anchor of that specific item. On their side of the house, they have instead dangling signifiers for opening government, red herrings which have no importance to the plot, or siloed symbols that are simple and not explored. And this is a real problem in a lot of modern literature, which is increasingly moving away from the Chekov's gun approach, is that you have a lot of stories that say they're exploring something but are really just depicting it. Which is why you have a lot of sort of useless, unimportant sexual assault scenes in stories rather than ones that have to take on a meaning and purpose in the author, because it creates a problem for the author they have to solve. How do I show the gun in this scene if I've been using it in this scene and this scene and this scene in this way, and later on it's going to fire? I need to investigate and think critically about what I want to say about love, or what I want to say about hatred, or what I want to say about violence, or all these things in the context of violence. It's far better because it's I think there's 3 reasons generally why it's better. The first is, I just think it relates to our own emotional truths and experiences about the world. Like, I can't tell you what a blade means for me in simple language, but I can feel when symbols are complex and relate to them in different ways. It's not a conscious, oh, they do this and they do this. It's about your emotional reality, your experience in the moment. That's what catharsis means, right? That's what the feeling of catharsis is. It's the weight in your chest in those kinds of moments. It's why those symbols stick with you and you think about them and ponder them after time. Secondly, as I said, it forces writers to solve problems, think critically, engage with their own text, actually be a proper writer in those moments. And thirdly, I think it's just sort of cathartic in those moments, rather than the superficial joy that they say on their side of the house. They have a distribution, and also the final thing I'll tell you is just in terms of distribution of thematic weight, you spend more time with these symbols when there's fewer of them. You spend more time engaging with them, like when you're like reading about them in classrooms or thinking about them at home. Your shorter stories a lot of the times, which is beneficial for these kinds of things. They take on more thematic weight. Second argument is about audience agency. So I think this is more just kind of a wider, like very literal interpretation of Chekov's gun here. Think about writers like Ernest Hemingway, for example. They're often simple, sparse stories which gain thematic weight through the manoeuvring of items and characters throughout the plot and the audience's engagement with them. Chekhov's gun also applies, as we POI'd and was accepted, to explanations of themes, imagery, etc. And what's I think important here is that a lot of writers have a real problem, right? And the problem is that you really want your audience to like you. You want them to think your book was great. You want to be a great writer. And you have to trust them. You're in a position of vulnerability with them. Because you have an idea for what this thing means. You have an idea of what you want to display here, but you don't know if you can trust them. And that's where you end up with a lot of writers going on long passages of purple prose, explaining a complex emotion, rather than just saying, "My mom died today." I think we get far more of these things on our side of the house. Because Chekhov's gun is the thing that calls you as a writer to question yourself. Do I need to explain this any further? Do I need to go into more detail on this? Can I let this moment just lie? Does this scene need another piece of action happening within it? You allow that simplicity to come to the fore, and audience agency therefore becomes paramount. Why is audience agency so strong here? And you just get better engagement with the stories. You get an autonomous interaction with the part of the audience. The feeling just comes from inside you. Analogously, I think you can think about how experiences of love feel like when they happen within your own life. Jack will take 2 apologies. Versus when you have depictions of love in like a Hallmark story. It feels more rich and it feels more real when it comes from you. But it also means you bring more of your own personal interpretation and autonomy to it. Your own experiences of love, your own experiences of violence, and those kinds of things come in when you're actually critically engaging and questioning the text, thinking about the themes that it's exploring and that kind of thing. It also makes you a better reader otherwise. You are on the lookout in other texts, in other movies, etc. for themes. Why did they hang the gun on that wall? Is this going to be important? What does this come to mean? And at the end of the story, you have all that in your mind and you're engaging with those kinds of things. The counterfactual, I also, is the only reason why subversion of Chekhov's gun ever works, right? Is because audiences are now thinking about the fact that something was laid up and not put up later. So you need to have Chekhov's gun in order to subvert it anyways, right? That's why literary principles commonly exist. The comparative on their side is interpassivity. Interpassivity, meaning a text that wants to interpret itself, leaves the audience as a mere observer of the fact of the play happening, rather than an active participant in the story, no doubt that story. You get more autonomous audiences, more complex and rich symbols, and better stories. Thank you very much.
CG, take it one. The burden of closing government is much lower than maybe it appears, because we just say that aspects of non-majoritarian theme, setting, or character are naturally attention-grabbing, because they are unusual, they usually are reflected in majoritarian views. What that means then is that if a character has a physical disability, there is an expectation among the readers, and therefore of the editors of the book, that that disability will be a central part of the plot, that it will come up in some meaningful way that wouldn't be true of someone who is able-bodied. But in real life, people with physical disabilities just do like regular stuff. But there's that aspect of experience which is very, very, very rarely reflected in an environment where Chekhov's gun is the norm, because always those aspects of character or setting or theme are expected to play a significant role. Similarly, if a movie is set in Southeast Chicago, there is an expectation that the over-policing of Black America, or the lasting harms of redlining, or some other type of things like that are going to be reflected in the media that exists. This is Chekhov's gun. The idea that those aspects ought to be reflected in some significant way because those are the traditionally ones associated with those places. What that means then is that in the real world, the only type of black media that gets greenlit in Hollywood is media that's about blackness, as opposed to media about white people, which is just like them doing lots of other types of stuff. That type of normalization is the unique access of closing government. Like we get a Friends that's set in Southeast Chicago that's just about them being friends, as opposed to all of the other things that usually contain these types of media. Without Chekhov's gun, diverse minority experiences can just exist in media without being the center of that media. And that normalization effect means that people's real lives are reflected, just them and their regular experiences, and that means that their reality is reflected, as opposed to that of like what perceived to be important for those individual aspects of identity in those places. Let's talk a little bit about closing opposition and then go through the rest of the debate. Closing opposition describes the idea of having complex stories, and that now authors have to have some amount of consideration when they're using Chekhov's gun. The question, though, isn't of one of binary whether consideration exists or doesn't exist. We argue that the consideration will just change rather than disappear altogether. Because now, details need to be evaluated with a multiplicity of factors. So still you consider whether your detail is relevant to the later part of your plot, but you also consider whether that detail, for instance, will resonate with a certain type of your audience, or whether it will reflect certain aspects of your audience in that kind of way. So the purpose still exists, and therefore you need to make considerations based on that purpose. It's just not on whether that's only on the future of the plot, as in the gun needs to go off because the plot needs to progress, or maybe the gun will reflect something else that isn't about specifically the plot. So for instance, it's more reflected to people in the environment that it exists in, or it's more like connecting the people who are involved in those places. So I don't think the consideration changes overall. The last thing I'll say on CO here is like, some stories will do this anyway. Like insofar as people with authors want to, people who are authors like want to achieve this level of like relevance in their stories, then sure, even without the literary principle, there's still a general guidance towards doing so in the first place. So like you still involve features that will eventually become relevant later on. I don't think the complexity of stories meaningfully changes. I'll go to OO now because realistically a lot of CO material tends to come from OO too. Humans like to have questions answered is the central premise of opening opposition. I just say, do they? Here are 3 reasons why maybe they won't. 1, because people like to fill in gaps to their own personal tastes. As in, humans can answer the questions how they like. As in, what the hell ever happened to like Mater in Cars 3, probably goes away a little bit even though he's a center in Cars 2. People like answering those questions because they can imagine it based on their own vision of what happened in those places. This is why people really don't like it when things are head to them like the exact hair color of someone when the movie comes on, because they had their own understandings of the things in the first place. So people actually like to answer questions themselves rather than always having the author answer the questions by saying, well, here's the gun, and instead of thinking about what it could be, it'll always be this thing as it's dictated in the first place. Humans like being able to answer the questions themselves because then they can answer them how they like to, as opposed to how the author wants to. Second, I think humans just like thinking, as in the idea of the complexity and having to really think through aspects, even when it isn't dictated to you exactly what the gun was for, is to the advantage of humans because they like that engagement in the first place. That's why they're reading, otherwise probably they'd be doing something else that requires much less attention. So people like the idea of answering questions because the process of doing so is satisfying, even as answering the question itself is satisfying. And thirdly, and I think most interestingly, is the principle of immersion. Because having questions answers doesn't heighten immersion because the characters don't know the answers themselves. So if you're trying to imagine yourself as being someone in that character, in that situation, then you don't want to know any more than they do in those instances. So actually not having the questions answered makes you feel more connected with the characters because you have an understanding that's similar to theirs. Because they aren't only having the gun on the wall highlighted, that is the characters, they're having everything in the room highlighted. So now you can more easily track to that experience because you aren't just seeing only the relevant details, you're seeing all of the details. That means you're more immersed in those ways. That's 3 good reasons. They don't just mitigate opening opposition, but successfully flip them, as in people actually don't like to have their questions answered, and therefore only uniquely on CG can we access that. Go for it.
CG analysis explain why tokenism is palatable, thus profitable, and there's always a push for it because we expect this ability to play a part. I think that then probably means the more you prove that humans aren't critical, the worse tokenisms you get. Your analysis is not specific enough to the Chekov guide.
Tokenism is maybe not the right way to think about this. This is much more simple than that. It's just the idea that these important, salient features don't feature as a meaningful part of the plot. Chekov's gun says that all salient features have to have a meaningful part of the plot. We say all of these salient features just shouldn't, because that means we have a more authentic reflection of reality as it exists. I don't think the tokenism thing matters as you describe it. The most important problem with opening opposition is the exclusivity problem. Because a lot of things that they describe, for instance, analysis like, well, this is a good way to filter out bad authors, is a good explanation of why this principle is a way to achieve that goal, but not a good explanation as to why it's the only way. So for instance, filtering between different types of authors seems like it could also be done by like other types of writing style differences that readers would observe. So for instance, if they did like the 7 guns on the wall thing, which I know Dylan quite likes, but like it's actually, if that's a bad idea, isn't necessarily because it doesn't appropriately subscribe to the principle, because people don't resonate with that type of writing. So there are lots of other principles that are easily proxies for this kind of thing. I'm unclear why there's uniqueness on that front. On opening government say a few things. Most importantly, they say that the gun is sometimes useful but not necessary, and therefore we have more realistic depictions, more discussions, and fan theory, it's not as predictable, stuff like that. But opening government describes the solution, but not the problem that it solves. So for instance, why isn't literature right now sufficiently realistic? Maybe they make it more so, but why is that a problem that exists? Or more clearly, like why doesn't fan fiction have enough material to write upon? Like surely there's lots of material that everyone finds, even if Chekov's gun is used. So it's unclear why there's a problem that they solve in the first place. And we're going to weigh against authors here when they talk about the catharsis that exists there. Because even a poorly performing book probably has a few thousand readers. So if you buy our impacts at 0.1% of the impacts they have on authors, then clearly that outweighs it because there are just so many more of them that multiply together. What we say is that it is better to be reflected in media in a regular way that offers more catharsis to people because their real life isn't always about the single thing that defines them, for instance, their disability, but it's just about like the life that they live overall. In general, then, I had something else written here. Cop half Sabor, CO's on the floor, Nixon 4.
You have two core reasons on it. They say that people will handhold audiences, so it's not immersive. But their reasons to handhold audiences are that, like, the nature of modern audiences, they're on their phone, so that's non-comparative. We'll come back to that in a sec. The other thing is, teachers and critics enforce this as a literary principle. As pointed out by the deputy leader of the opposition, there's obviously other things that are enforced. Let's be very clear on them and why they exist. One, teachers and critics still like imagery. If you don't have any imagery in your text, people will go, well, that was a bit boring, I can't picture it, what is happening, what's going on, who are you? And crucially as well, per Dylan's analysis, all artists themselves like to engage in a decent amount of imagery, so it's obviously still going to be present. The comparative here is that they have too much. We have a countervailing narrative, not to be a boring debater, but ultimately, if you don't want to have your imagery be pointless, but you still ought to have imagery, you only include images that are relevant to something about the character, right? So the gun may be there to show that this person is actually like Republican coded, because you need something on the wall when you are making your set for your play, right? You just need something there, and you make very deliberate choices. It has to be necessary there. We need to choose something that is most relevant to the character. The second thing is teachers and critics still like subversion and shock. In fact, as Dylan points out, we flipped subversion and shock, which the Prime Minister tries to claim, because we give another core avenue of cinematic dialogue. What do we mean by this? Chekov's Gone, as a relatively dominant literary principle, gives them that they understand. For example, they would be shocked if I didn't take 2 POIs. You're that I would, right? And then it's not a norm to have, like, Chekhov's gun writ large. If there's a gun on the wall, it won't be used. It's never, it just means nothing when the gun goes unused. And that's why, obviously, we can create more instances for subversion. I also want to note teachers and critics also just don't like overly simplifications about depictions of minorities, which also then engages in CG's case and how critics will lambast them. That is the only way in which people ever use the minority status in our side of the house. The third thing is, as pointed out, though a strict principle, that Chekov's gone, different mediums and genres interact with it differently. We put that in the POI, DLO tries to reuse it themselves. Let's give the structural reason. This is because Chekov was a playwright. When this principle expands across different mediums, they ultimately interact with it in their own way, right? So books often just obviously have more imagery and descriptive text than plays, because the play just shows you it, right? It has the set. And that meant that they still wanted a large emphasis on imagery, but the Chekov's government, no, this imagery must be important, must be relevant. So you've got the confluence of the two. You've got a relevant amount of imagery, a relevant amount of world building, but not too much, and that still then creates a range of optionality in what people like. Do you want to be fully utilitarian, or have a little bit more imagery, but still useful imagery at all times? But even if you ignore all of this rebuttal, I want to point out that hand-holding is symmetric, because their reason for it was symmetric, right? That production studios want you to do this, right? And as Dylan pointed out, it's even more likely on their side, because artists want you to like what they say. Artists want you to understand their text in a very specific way. So even when you have a lot of imagery, even when you have a lot of side aspects, potential areas of lore, they're still very deliberate about making sure you know what is correct. Which means, A, fan fiction and lore is somewhat choked out on their side of the house too. People go, no, you are wrong. It is obviously about this because the author centered it. The author made it the whole point. So all these other side things you're talking about are waffle and nonsense. No one cares. Go away. And that's not a very nice community. But B, I would just point out that if hand-holding and editing and all these things are prominent, secondary characters that they want to discuss, probably just don't exist on our side, right? You don't have that secondary character because they're not necessary completely. But on their side, you might fluff them up, you might have them there, but you don't get a rich detailing of them either, right? Because you still don't want to confuse the author. You don't want to make someone seem important when they are not. You don't want to have too much confusion for them, meaning they don't get rich secondary or tertiary characters either. Before I move on to meaning and enjoyment, I'll take the first POI.
Don't you sometimes enjoy a red herring POI over revealing the extension every single time?
No, I think that's one of Dylan's worst traits. No, but the real thing is that ultimately, that's something where, again, it is a dominant norm. It is a principle that your POI is meant to be relevant, right? Which means it's kind of quirky and cool when Dylan does the opposite. Separate thing on reading and on meaning and enjoyment. OO discuss rereadability. We scale this in 2 ways. 1, the cinematic dialogue analysis coming from Dylan means the first reading is more enjoyable. It's not just when you go back, you go, I wonder what's going to happen with the gun. As soon as you read about the gun, you're questioning it. You're negotiating with the text constantly. I wonder in what way it's going to be used. So the first reading is more enjoyable. Secondly, Dylan scales it by pointing out when you can only have props that are relevant, because you don't want your character's hands empty, those props will be used in multiple different instances, which adds to the richness of the symbol. The fact that potentially the wife may get shot later on, at one point is like cleaning the gun or something, because they want to show the wife's doing something for the husband to show like problematic dynamics, but you don't want to introduce some other random prop that isn't necessary. So you use what is already available. Maybe the knife, maybe the gun, but ultimately it means that they ultimately enable the husband to take their own life at the end of the day. You add to the richness of symbology by reusing the object multiple times. And that means we ultimately mean the initial text is in and of itself better and more readable, beating out opening opposition. Because there are other claims around self-editing, but Elo themselves point out that there's a huge amount of emphasis on editing regardless, right? Coming from production studios, which I think makes themselves something non-comparative. And the last thing is on like uncertainty. I think, sure, some people do, as Gilbert points out, some people don't. The crucial thing here is the capacity for us to negotiate with literature. To what degree do we like certainty? To what degree do we not? And I think that is the way where most people get genuine enjoyment out of literature. And that's what Dylan talks about. How when you have richer symbols, there is more ways to think about what that symbol means. How when you have less hand-holding and more functional story, there's more ways to impart your own vision of it, your own way in which how you would negotiate with that plot. And this just means, I didn't get offered a second one, this just means ultimately that there is, firstly, greater intensity of enjoyment. That symbol isn't just kind of nice. It means a lot. It makes you question something about yourself. It gives you catharsis when you really think about it deep down, that is what a blade means to you. But secondly, we get scale of enjoyment because we create capacity for multiple people with multiple different subjectivities to enjoy something because the meaning isn't prescribed. The meaning is something that you can negotiate with from our and our side. The response to this is authors want to do this anyway. Does not engage with Dylan's analysis, which is that authors have a huge inhibition against this. They want you to like them. They want to hold your hand no matter what. But the problem is now we tell that author to stop it, to be a good, genuine writer, so we create that proper art. CG tried to weigh on vulnerability against us. I think three things. One, they are wrong about who authors are. They use like judge-style analysis for artists. Go to any art block, outside any literature store, any play, and tell me they're all rich white men. It's just not true. Secondly, even if they are right, then they're non-comparative. Because I'm not sure why that rich white man ever makes his characters black. Why that would ever happen. And crucially, they gave no real reasons for it apart from tokenization, which as pointed out is kind of non-comparative. Time.